We found the crate just inside the trees where the rose broke and the shade began boards swollen from years of wet seasons, rope sunk into the wood like veins. My hand fit under the lip and the earth let go with a tired sigh, one long breath from a field that had been holding it in too long. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I used to say that quiet is a virtue, but too much quiet can teach a man the wrong things. After I turned in my badge at 60, I settled into a small brick house on the edge of Jefferson City. Mornings had a steady rhythm, black coffee a walk that ran the length of 2 blocks, and back then a newspaper folded across the kitchen table just so. Traffic hummed, the mail carrier lifted a hand, and the biggest decision most days was whether to oil the front porch hinges or let them sing a little longer. That's what retirement taught me: maintenance, small adjustments, a life that creaked in familiar places. Mill Creek was a different quiet. In 1964, it was one main street, a courthouse with a clock that missed by a minute or two, and a grocery that put the peaches near the door when the heat climbed past 90. The land threw itself out in measured squares: soybeans, corn, sorghum, and the roads between were 2 lanes wide with ditches that flashed frogs at night. Folks waved with 2 fingers off the steering wheel. The radio carried Cardinals games over the static, and the weather out here never lied. If the sky had that copper tint before supper, you knew what was coming. I wasn't there in 64, not yet. What I know about those days is stitched from ledgers, photographs, and people who could still describe the sound of grain unloading into an auger. They remember how Robert would back his truck to the co-op scale in a straight line, ease to a stop without looking behind him, step down, nod once. No show in him, just work. Elaine had a different pace. She grew tomatoes in tidy hoops and set a quilt across the porch railing. When the light got long, shaking dust out with quick snaps you could hear from across the road. She never raised her voice, people said, but she had a way of fixing a person with steady eyes that told the truth without a second sentence. On Sundays, her voice floated above the pews, never the loudest, always in tune. The Halloway place sat a mile off the county road, a white house that had seen better paint and a barn that leaned from the prevailing wind. The well was 20 feet behind the kitchen door. A length of rope hung near the barn, like the kind of tool you keep because every farmer needs a tie-off more than once in a week. It wasn't a pretty farm, but it was honest, the sort of place where the porch light went on at 500 a.m., and you could tell breakfast by the kind of steam rising from the kitchen window. Those mornings, if the air was still, you could hear spoons against cups. Back then, Sheriff Tom Glay held the county like a man who expected his name to carry weight. His cruiser idled more than it patrolled, stationed at the diner or parked behind the courthouse under the elm. People called him Tom to his face, and the sheriff when it mattered, which is to say, almost always. He wore his belt high and his hat like he believed the brim created shade where he stood. He didn't have to raise his voice to make things happen. He just had to show up. Around the same time, a name began appearing in the business pages and bank memos: Richard Kane. He built silos taller than church steeples and could finish a handshake with a signature by the end of the hour. You saw him at harvest suppers. Big Laugh clean ties a hand on the shoulder of an alderman as if they'd known one another since grade school. People worked for him, did well by him, and were not eager to find out what happened when they didn't. That's not an accusation. It's how power feels when the checks clear on Friday. In a town like Mill Creek, most news rides the wind before it prints in the paper. I've sat on enough front steps to know what gossip sounds like when it's worried it might be true. In late June of 64, a few men at the co-op said Robert looked tight in the jaw. He'd stand at the counter, thumb pressing a straight line along an invoice, and say he'd bring it current when the second planting paid. Folks nodded because that was the correct answer and also because they believed he would. Elaine carried cash to the feed store and kept receipts folded in her purse corners squared. They weren't lavish people. They measured twice and cut once, and then they saved the offcuts in case they could be useful later. If you want to understand a place, walk it with the sun low. That's how I saw Mill Creek when I first went back after I retired. The fields gave off that warm green smell, and the bugs started up as if a switch had been flipped. The courthouse clock coughed a wrong time. I parked where the asphalt turned to gravel and made the last mile on foot, dust puffing around my shoes. A meadowlark moved along the fence like punctuation. I wasn't chasing anything that afternoon. I just wanted to stand where a particular kind of peace used to live. The Holloway mailbox leaned forward the way a body does when it's listening. Paint had flaked off the house in long, curled strips like peels from an apple. A rusted hook hung on a barn beam, and the rope beside it swayed even without a breeze, the fibers stiff from years of weather. I try not to borrow feeling from places, but some places don't give you the choice. The Holloway yard had that sound you only hear on a broad, flat wind moving through stalk stubble. A music that's there whether you want to hear it or not. I pictured a day before everything tipped a sack of feed carried across the yard. A laugh from the kitchen. A church bulletin taped under a magnet shaped like a rooster. Frank Dalton, who lived east right up against a field edge, told me he remembered Elaine rinsing pint jars on the stoop, setting them to dry on a towel that had 7 blue stripes. Frank had a way of counting things like that. He'd note how many fence staples he used to fix a corner brace, or how many seconds passed between June thunder and rain that actually hit dirt. When men like Frank speak, you listen to the count more than the conclusion. My life then was as ordinary as a metronome. Retired cops don't quit solving. We just learn which problems belong to us and which we can let pass without making a scene. I dropped by the hardware store to argue about screw sizes like any other stubborn man, then roast chicken at 375 degrees while a ball game leaned against the evening. On Thursdays, I helped my neighbor haul his trash to the dump before supper traffic. If the phone rang after 10, it meant someone had misjudged a distance or slid into something, and I would talk them through it, calm and patient, because I still had the voice for it. That's what a steady life looks like from inside small chores, reliable coffee, the particular relief of a front door that latches on the first try. I thought about the Halloways more when the house went quiet, not out of superstition habit really. A case with no edges has a way of getting under your fingernails, so I turned it over without meaning to. I pictured Robert tying off a gate with a square knot he could make with eyes closed. I saw Elaine scolding a raccoon with a broom and then laughing at herself for the performance. I imagined a dog who knew the sound of the pantry jar and who never stopped hoping for the soft scrape of its lid. That's how I come to know people I've never met through their routines. In those days, the town paraded what it valued in ordinary ways. The cafe served meatloaf on Wednesdays because the sheriff liked it and because they always had. Men leaned back in metal lawn chairs after supper and told the day's weather the way other men tell jokes. Kids played stickball until the porch lights blinked twice, one for time to come home, one for I mean it. On Saturday, church ladies ironed blouses and set pies to cool right where the breeze could lift cinnamon into every room. The longer you sat with Mill Creek, the more the whole place made sense, like a quilt pattern that only reveals itself when you stand back from the stitches. It takes very little to knock a pattern off tempo. One afternoon in early July, a bank envelope slid into a stack of feed bills. The amount wasn't ruinous. It was just poorly timed. A dry spell had browned the edges of the fields, and every farmer knows the price of rain you didn't get. Robert would have done the math on the back of a seed brochure, he was that kind of man, and come up with a number that meant working later than he planned. Elaine would have brewed coffee at 4, set the kitchen clock 5 minutes fast, and laid out a clean shirt for him anyway. These are not confessions, just gestures that tell who they were. Small efforts, quiet pride. The kind that holds a marriage together. People always ask me later on when the first hairline fractures showed. Not the break, just the faint line that suggests one is coming. I have a list no one else keeps. The dog that barked at coyotes every single week didn't raise its voice one Tuesday night. The porch bulb burned longer than usual on a Thursday, a halo against a blank yard. On Friday, Frank swore he felt a hum in the ground the way you sometimes do when a heavy engine rolls in the distance. He didn't feel it in his feet, he felt it in his ribs. He said that like he was embarrassed to use the word. I stepped into the Holloway kitchen for the first time years after all that, but the room still knew how to tell the right story. You could stand by the sink and see why they kept the salt by the window and why the table sat where it did, lined to catch morning sun in winter and evening light in July. The paint had given up in ragged panels, but the layout was stubbornly practical like the people who used it. I set my hand against the jamb and held it there until the house felt like a wrist under my fingers, thin pulse still going. On the porch, where the floorboards cupped rain in shallow arcs, I could trace the clean path where feet had learned to step around a soft place without thinking. Some nights I'd pull to the shoulder at the corner where the gravel road meets the county highway and sit with the engine off, windows down. The fields have their own conversation after dark, crickets working as if paid by the note wind coming in low row by row. Out here, headlights are a language. You know your neighbor's Ford by the way it dips right at the culvert. You can count a visitor by the way they touch the brakes where folks who live here simply don't. If you sit long enough, you can tell the whole town by the way it moves through the dark. I meant to go home early that night. I had half a pot of coffee waiting and a ball game in the 8th. Instead, I stayed until the sky fell all the way to black and the elm shadows thickened like felt. A moth tapped the windshield twice. Somewhere a screen door answered back. The road beyond the Holloway turnoff held still. No gravel lifted. No beams pushed through the corn. The porch at the White House glowed steady, a small circle of amber in a yard that had learned every story there is to tell. I watched that light longer than I should have, listening for the familiar chorus. The dog's bark, the clatter of a pail, the fast run of footsteps across the porch to fetch something forgotten. The night kept its own counsel. When I finally turned the key, the dashboard clock read 10:11 p.m. The porch bulb at the Holloway place was still burning, patient as a held breath, and the road behind me was a ribbon with no headlights coming. The porch light was still burning when I pulled away from the Holloway place that night, the way it had been in the old photographs, warm against the dark, but somehow colder for it. By the time I reached the main road, the silence from those fields had worked its way under my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there just beyond what headlights could reach. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I kept seeing that rope hanging by the barn door swaying when there was no wind. Maybe it was nothing. But in my experience, nothing has a way of turning into something if you stare at it long enough. A week later, I found myself sitting in my study after midnight, an old file box open on the floor beside me. It was marked simply, Holloway R.E. 1964. The folder smelled like attic dust and age. Inside were the old police reports I'd once read as a rookie when the sergeant handed them over and said, "Read this if you want to know what a dead end looks like." I had, and the truth was I never stopped. I spread the documents across my desk, the paper thin as onion skin now. Each page carried more white space than words. Missing persons. Voluntary disappearance suspected. No sign of struggle. Those phrases used to mean something when I was young. Now they sounded like excuses made by men who wanted to go home before dark. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and studied the photographs, black and white edges curling. The breakfast table with half-eaten eggs. Elaine's glasses folded on the counter beside a dish towel. The dog's chain still fastened to the porch post. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic. Just absence. You can always tell when a case like that was written off too fast. The language gets too clean, too efficient. I knew the man who'd signed those reports. Sheriff Tom Glay. Folks said he was steady, the kind who'd show up at your wedding and your funeral in the same hat. But looking at those pages now, I saw how quickly his pen moved to close the door. That summer had been dry and the records showed it. Corn yields down small debts, stacking in quiet places. Robert had missed a few payments on the farm loan. I could picture the conversation at the bank, the manager leaning back in his chair, hands folded, saying words like arrangements and extensions. Men like that always talk soft when the papers are about to get mean. Elaine would have done her best to keep things together. She taught Sunday school baked for the congregation. Every witness said the same thing: she was gentle, careful, steady, which made me wonder how steady she sounded when the last person heard her voice. I was 60, then retired, but there's a certain kind of itch that doesn't go away just because you stop wearing a badge. So, one afternoon I drove back down to Ransom County. The courthouse hadn't changed, same cracked tile floors, same smell of paper and polish. The young clerk behind the counter looked at me like I'd stepped out of a black and white photograph myself. I showed him my old credentials, told him I was looking for an unsolved from the 60s. He hesitated, then said most of those files were still in boxes downstairs in the basement. I told him that's exactly where I wanted to be. The lights down there buzzed like tired bees. Rows of metal shelves ran to the far wall, every one of them stacked with cardboard boxes sagging in the middle. I found the one marked Halloway after a few minutes, heavier than I expected. Dust came off it in clouds when I opened the lid. The first pages were what I'd seen before the official forms, the inventory lists. Then, tucked between two witness statements, was a newspaper clipping I didn't remember. The date was July 20th, 6 days after the couple vanished. Local farmer reports. Noises in night. The headline read, "The man quoted was named Frank Dalton. I knew the name immediately. He'd lived 2 miles east of the Halloway place. According to the article, he'd told reporters he heard a truck engine late that night, followed by shouting, then silence. But Dalton's name didn't appear anywhere in the official report. Not once. That wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. Someone had made sure that voice never made it into the record." I leaned back in the chair, staring at the page, wondering what made a sheriff ignore a man like Dalton. Either he thought the witness was lying, or he didn't want him heard. I'd seen both before. Outside, the sky had turned the color of pewter by the time I climbed the courthouse steps. I stood there a while, looking across the square at the diner where I used to grab coffee on long shifts. The same neon sign buzzed in the window. Inside, the same stools lined the counter. I walked in, sat down at the far end, and ordered a cup. The waitress was maybe in her 40s, kind eyes, steady hands. When I asked if she knew the Halloway story, she looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "My grandma used to tell it," she said quietly. "Said the land swallowed them. Said you could still hear them at night if you listened close." She smiled when she said it, but it wasn't a happy smile. I thanked her, left a few dollars, and drove the 10 miles north toward Mill Creek. The road narrowed as I got closer. The fields on either side were bare now, the corn cut down to stubble. The Halloway house appeared slowly, as if the land was reluctant to let me see it again. The paint had peeled back to gray. The porch sagged deeper. I parked by the fence line and stepped out, the air dry and sharp enough to taste. Inside, the smell hit first dust rot, old wood, holding on to the last of itself. The kitchen was smaller than it looked in the photographs, but everything was where it should have been. The table in the center, the window above the sink, the wall clock frozen at 7:42. I could almost see Elaine standing there reaching for her glasses. Robert maybe stepping out the back door to check the barn. That's when I noticed the grooves. 2 faint lines carved across the floorboards near the door frame. I crouched down, ran my fingers along them. Too straight to be random, too shallow to be a tool mark. They looked like drag lines. I checked the old report again later. There was a note about possible scuffs near rear entrance, inconclusive. Seeing them in person, there was nothing inconclusive about it. Whatever left those marks had weight. That night I stayed in a roadside motel about 10 miles south of the farm. The room smelled like bleach and tired air conditioning. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan as it ticked with every rotation, listening to the hum of semis out on the highway. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lines on the floor. I heard the faint echo of Dalton's missing testimony. The truck engine, the shouting, the dog barking once before silence. By dawn, I'd already decided what I had to do. The county library sat on Main Street next to the post office. It had the same smell all old libraries share: paper polish and time. The librarian, gray hair wound in a tight bun, looked up when I asked about Frank Dalton. "He's still around," she said. "Lives out by Mill Creek. Trailer near the tree line. Keeps to himself these days." That was all I needed. The road to Dalton's place cut through flat country and then dipped low toward a creek bed. His trailer sat on a small rise, a rusted pickup parked beside it. Wind chimes made from old spoons clinked in the breeze. Dalton himself was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky like it owed him an answer. When I introduced myself, he didn't look surprised. "You're not the first to come asking," he said. His voice had that brittle edge of a man who's spent too long alone. I told him I'd read what he said in the paper, that his name wasn't in the official file. He laughed once, dry and short. "That's because the sheriff told me to keep my mouth shut. He told the story slow in pieces, the way old men do when every word costs a little air. Said he and his wife woke that night to the sound of an engine bigger than a tractor, heavier. Then came voices, rough, low, not the Halloways. He heard the dog barking, then a single gunshot. After that, nothing but the engine idling for a while before driving off. I asked him if he ever told anyone else. He nodded. Told Glay the next morning. He said I'd been drinking. I hadn't. He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'Frank, you didn't hear a thing.' And that was the end of it. I asked if he'd ever gone back. Dalton's eyes drifted toward the line of trees behind his property. Once he said, 'Week or two later, couldn't stay away.' I walked the edge of their field, and there it was, a patch of dirt that looked too fresh, big enough for two. He looked down when he said it, like the words still weighed the same as the day he first spoke them. I thanked him, but he waved it off. 'Don't thank me,' he said. 'You can't unbury what's already settled.' That night, back at the motel, I sat at the small desk with a county map spread open. I traced the Halloway property with a pen, then marked the eastern edge where Dalton had pointed. The distance between his trailer and that tree line was less than a mile. It made sense, the engine, the voices, the silence. All of it lined up like fence posts. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but I knew what would happen. The same small-town machinery that had buried this once would grind it down again. I needed something they couldn't erase: a record, a photograph, anything that would hold up under light. Sleep didn't come that night either. Every time the wind rattled the window, I imagined headlights cutting across the fields, the low growl of an engine idling somewhere it didn't belong. I knew I was chasing ghosts, but ghosts have a way of leading you where the living won't. When the sun came up, the fields outside the window shimmered gold under the first heat. I folded the map, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and told myself this time I wouldn't walk away. The land might forget names, but it never forgets what it's seen. And somewhere beneath those trees, I was certain the truth was still waiting to be found. The morning after I met Frank Dalton, the air felt different. It had that heavy stillness that comes after a confession, like the world needs a minute to absorb what's been said. I drove slow through Mill Creek, the windows down just enough to catch the scent of wet soil. The map I'd marked the night before sat on the passenger seat, the ink circle around that eastern tree line, dark and certain. For the first time, I wasn't chasing a memory. I was chasing direction. By noon, I was back at the Halloway farm, standing in the yard with a thermos of coffee and the hum of cicadas vibrating through the heat. The house didn't look any different, but I could feel a change in it, as though something beneath the ground had stirred when Dalton finally spoke his piece. I stood by the porch and imagined headlights sweeping across this same yard almost 40 years earlier, a truck idling somewhere near the fields, men moving with a purpose they didn't bother to hide. I'd seen that kind of purpose before in crime scenes in men who did wrong, but didn't lose sleep over it. You could smell it like oil on their hands. Back in town, the courthouse basement was cooler than I remembered. The young clerk recognized me this time and didn't ask questions when I said I needed to pull the Halloway files again. I worked through the papers for hours, tracing each note and name, letting my mind map the pattern of what wasn't there. Missing statements, half-completed reports, one deputy's log ending mid-sentence. I found myself reading between the lines more than I read the lines themselves. When I came across Sheriff Glay's signature, sharp, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that thinks it can stand forever, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. A cover-up doesn't always come from panic. Sometimes it comes from habit. From knowing which doors stay closed if you just keep the hinges oiled. By late afternoon, the courthouse had thinned out and I walked across the street to the diner. Same waitress, same quiet hum of locals talking about rain that hadn't come. She brought my coffee without asking. "You still chasing ghosts?" she said with a half-smile. I told her I was just trying to listen to one. That seemed to land with her. She refilled my cup and leaned closer. "If you're looking for ghosts, talk to the ones who never left. My aunt says Frank wasn't the only one who heard that truck." I looked up. "Who else?" She hesitated, weighing whether it was worth saying. "Mary Collins," she said finally. "She was a kid then. Her daddy woke up that night too. Said he saw lights out past the pasture. You can find her up near Benton now. Widow. She don't do interviews, but she might talk to you." It took 2 days to track Mary Collins down. Her house sat on a small hill outside town, one of those places where time collects quietly in the corners. She was in her 70s, thin as a rail, her hands marked by years of work. When I introduced myself and mentioned the Halloways, she didn't invite me in right away. She just looked at me a long time, as if trying to decide whether I was part of the silence or something else. Finally, she opened the screen door. We sat in her kitchen, the air thick with the smell of sweet tea and lemon polish. I didn't push. People like Mary need space to circle the truth before they land on it. She said she remembered her father waking up that night, July 14th, 1964. He'd heard something out near the fields, told her to stay in bed, then went to the window. She followed him anyway, curious. Through the glass, she saw what he saw, headlights moving slow where no road ran. "Daddy said it wasn't a tractor," she whispered, staring past me at something I couldn't see. Said it sounded heavier. He just stood there listening, then turned off the lamp. After a while, it went quiet. We never talked about it again. She paused, gripping her glass with both hands. You could hear the dog, though. Just once. Then nothing. I thanked her, but she shook her head. "Don't thank me. I should have spoken sooner." When I asked why she hadn't, she looked at me the way people do when they've carried guilt longer than they've carried anything else. "Because nobody would have listened," she said softly. They already decided how that story ended. I left her house with the sky bruising toward evening and a restlessness crawling under my skin. I'd spent a career chasing what people didn't say, but this was different. This silence felt organized. It had architecture. Somebody had built it brick by brick, and the sheriff had been the foreman. By the time I reached the motel, I knew I needed help, someone who could drag this story into light louder than I could. That night, flipping through the TV channels, I caught a rerun of that cable series Vanished America's Unsolved, the same one that had reopened the case months earlier. The producer's name flashed on screen: Sarah Whitaker. Young, sharp, no patience for small-town politics. I remembered thinking, she's got more reach than I do, and probably more nerve, too. I found her email through the station's website and sent a short message before I could talk myself out of it. "There's something the files missed. Call me." She did 3 days later. Her voice was brisk, professional. "You're the retired detective who won't let this go," she said. I told her I'd been called worse. She agreed to meet. We chose a neutral spot, a church basement 2 towns over, where she was filming a segment with a retired deputy. When I walked in, she was wrapping up lights blazing on the old man's lined face. She turned when she saw me, one brow lifted. "You came," she said. "You asked." We packed her gear in silence, then sat at a folding table with paper cups of burnt coffee between us. I laid out what I had: Dalton's testimony, the missing reports, Mary Collins's account. Her pen scratched across her notebook, fast and precise. When I finished, she looked at me a long time. "You think they're buried out there?" I nodded. Dalton saw a hole near the tree line. "Big enough for 2. She leaned back, exhaling through her teeth. "If that's true, we can't go through the sheriff's office." "Not yet." "I know," I said. "They'd bury it again before we got there." She smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed serious. "Then we'll do it ourselves." That night we drove out together. The road curved through open fields that seemed to breathe under the headlights. The Halloway house appeared out of the dark, like something half-remembered. Whitaker climbed out, slinging a camera bag over her shoulder, the red light on her recorder blinking in the dark. "This is it?" she asked quietly. "It was," I said. We walked toward the eastern trees, the ground soft beneath our boots. The air smelled of dry corn and rain that hadn't come yet. Dalton had said the hole was near the edge where the shadow breaks. When we reached it, I stopped. "Here," I said, pointing to a slight swell in the ground barely visible in the moonlight. She crouched, ran her hand over the soil. "Could be nothing. Or everything," I murmured. We didn't dig that night. Not yet. Instead, we documented camera angles, notes, measurements. Whitaker filmed the uneven rise of Earth, her lens steady even when her hands weren't. When we finished, she looked at me. "If we find something, you know what it means." I did. It meant waking a sleeping county. It meant names that still carried weight being dragged into daylight. It meant risk. But what haunted me more was what it meant if we didn't look. If we left them there another 40 years, forgotten under soil that wasn't theirs. I told her I'd meet her back here in 2 nights. She nodded. No hesitation. "We dig quiet," she said. That next night, sleep barely touched me. I sat on my porch until sunrise, the sky paling over the trees, wondering how many cases I'd walked away from over the years because someone higher up said to. Too many, I decided. This one wouldn't join them. 2 nights later, we parked half a mile from the farm and walked in through the fields, flashlights taped to narrow beams. The moon hung low, thin as a blade. We didn't talk much. When the shovel hit dirt, it made that hollow sound. I'll never forget the sound of ground that's been moved before. We worked slow, careful, sweat stinging our eyes. Around the 2nd hour, the metal caught on something hard. I knelt, brushed away soil, and saw the edge of wood. Old, swollen, but unmistakable. "Porter," she whispered, voice shaking. "What is that?" I slid the crowbar under the seam and lifted. The earth let go with a sigh, and the smell hit damp, sweet, unmistakable. Inside was a crate, rough, crude, big enough for 2. I didn't move for a while, just stared at it, my pulse drumming in my ears. Whitaker turned off the camera, but the red light still blinked. I don't think either of us breathed until she whispered, "We found them." I shook my head slowly. "We found proof," I said. "But they'll try to take it from us if we hand it over now." She understood right away. The same system that buried them could still bury this. We had to make sure the truth couldn't disappear again. By dawn, the hole was filled back and the ground smoothed. You'd never know we'd been there. But I could still feel the weight of that box pressing up from the soil beneath my boots. We drove in silence back toward town, the first light catching the edges of the horizon. Whitaker's camera sat between us, her fingers gripping it like it was the only thing keeping her steady. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. What happens now? I looked out the window, watching the fields blur past. Now, I said, we find the names that made this happen, and we make sure they can't hide anymore. The sun broke over the fields, then washing everything in pale gold, but the light didn't feel warm. It felt like exposure, the kind you can't step out of once it's begun. And as the road carried us back toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone somewhere already knew what we'd done. When the sun came up that morning, the road ahead of us looked like every other stretch of Missouri highway, just asphalt and light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. The crate we'd uncovered was back in the earth, hidden again under a thin skin of soil, but it was as if it had changed the air itself. The silence felt loaded now. Even the birds held back. Whitaker drove while I kept my eyes on the fields, half expecting headlights to appear behind us. When we reached the diner on the edge of Mill Creek, she parked and shut the engine off without saying anything. We just sat there a while, the ticking of the cooling motor filling the quiet. Then she said, if we go to the press first, they'll call it trespassing. If we go to the sheriff, it disappears again. So where does that leave us? I stared at the empty road and said, somewhere in the middle. Long enough to get proof that can't be argued away. The proof came faster than I expected. Later that afternoon, Whitaker met me at the county records office where the new clerk, young Nervous, had been helping her dig through property archives for footage and deeds. She waved me over to a table spread with faded documents. You need to see this, she said, sliding one toward me. It was a series of land transfer papers from 1964, right around the time the Halloways vanished. The name on the buyer's line was Richard Kane. The signature was crisp, almost proud. The seller line read, Estate of Robert and Elaine Halloway, notarized by none other than Sheriff Tom Glay. The date, 2 weeks after the disappearance. I felt a coldness climb my spine. He signed off on a sale before the missing were declared dead, I said quietly. She nodded. He didn't just close the case, he erased them from it. We photographed everything. Every document, every signature. Whitaker kept her camera steady, methodical. She didn't need direction, she understood the stakes. When we stepped out into the fading afternoon, the courthouse clock was striking 5, and I realized I hadn't eaten since dawn. We walked across the street to the same diner. The same waitress refilled our cups and said nothing, though I caught her looking at us a little too long. When she left, Whitaker leaned across the table and whispered, You think Glay's still alive? I told her I wasn't sure, but men like him rarely drift far from where their power once was. She made a note on her pad, then said, If he's alive, I want to hear him deny it to my face. I told her we'd do that after we made sure there was no way he could make the evidence vanish again. We spent the next 2 days quietly building a wall around what we'd found. Whitaker reached out to a contact at the Attorney General's office, someone she trusted not to leak to the local sheriff. I worked the old channels, calling a retired crime lab tech I'd known years back in Jefferson City. He owed me a favor. I told him we had soil samples and possible human remains from a private site that needed professional handling. I didn't say where. He said to get them to him discreetly, no chain of custody through the county. That night, under cover of fog rolling low over the fields, Whitaker and I returned to the farm. We dug carefully, only deep enough to reach a fragment of the crate's wood and what I recognized immediately as a fragment of bone, porous, pale, unmistakable. We collected what we needed, sealed it, and covered the ground again. When we left, the night was so still it felt like the earth was holding its breath. We drove back toward Jefferson City before dawn, keeping to side roads. The radio stayed off. When we stopped for gas outside, Rolla Whitaker looked over the rim of her cup and said, If you were wrong about this, if that's not them, you'd walk away, wouldn't you? I didn't answer right away. If I'm wrong, I said finally, then this is just dirt. But if I'm right, they've been waiting under it longer than either of us have been alive. She nodded once like she understood that wasn't something I could let go of. The lab tech, Carter, met us behind the state complex that afternoon. He was older now, slower but sharp as ever. He didn't ask questions. He just took the sample promised results by morning and told us to be careful driving back. "You're stirring up ghosts that have friends in high places," he said. That night, we got a motel room on the edge of town, the kind with curtains too thin for the neon outside. Whitaker sat cross-legged on the floor, transferring files to her external drive. I watched the glow of the screen on her face and thought how strange it was that justice might depend on something as fragile as a flash drive. She caught me looking and said, "You ever think about why you're still doing this? You're retired. You could have let it stay buried." I told her the truth that sometimes the dead don't ask for much, just one person who won't forget them. She nodded, slowly closed her laptop and said, "Then let's not forget." The call came at 8:13 the next morning. Carter's voice was steady, but there was something under it I hadn't heard in him before a tremor. "Sam," he said, "you were right. 2 distinct skeletal profiles, adult male and female. Cause of death looks consistent with blunt trauma to the skull. No animal interference. Whoever did it buried them careful." My hand tightened on the phone. He paused before adding, "And the wood on that crate milled in '63 from the same lot used in county storage projects. Whoever made it had access to government supplies." When I hung up, Whitaker was watching me. "Well?" she asked. "They're home," I said quietly. She exhaled long and slow. So what now? Now was the part neither of us could plan for. Within hours of Carter filing the preliminary report, whispers started. First, a call from a local contact warning me that the county had reopened the Halloway investigation for re-examination, which was bureaucratic code for damage control. Then, that evening, I saw a black sedan parked across from my house. It didn't follow when I left, but it didn't leave either. Whitaker wasn't surprised. "You dig up the wrong grave," she said, "and someone's always standing by with a shovel of dirt to throw back on it." We agreed to meet one last time at the Halloway property, film everything we'd learned, and hand it over to the Attorney General's contact that same night. No intermediaries, no county involvement, just truth straight and simple. When we reached the farm, the air was thick with the smell of rain. Storm clouds were rolling in gray and bruised at the edges. Whitaker set up her tripod by the porch, while I walked the perimeter one last time. I could feel the storm coming through the soles of my boots, that low vibration that always travels faster than thunder. From where I stood, I could see the exact line where the crate had lain. The trees leaned toward it, their roots wrapping down like fingers trying to hold something in place. Whitaker called out from the porch, "You ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. She began recording. Her voice stayed calm as she spoke into the mic, describing the discovery, the documents, the sheriff's signature, the sample analysis, all of it in her words preserved on tape. Halfway through, I caught a flash of light across the field. Headlights, slow, deliberate. "Sam?" she whispered, lowering the camera. "Someone's out there." I turned, shielding my eyes. The vehicle crept closer until the outline of an old pickup came into view. 2 men stepped out, one older, stocky, the other tall, with a ball cap pulled low. The older man called out, "Evening." Didn't expect visitors. I recognized the voice before I could place it. Sheriff Tom Glay was older now, white hair, but the same straight-backed confidence that once kept people in line. The man beside him carried the posture of someone used to standing guard. "You're trespassing," Glay said mildly. "That's county land now." I stepped forward. "That's funny. The deed says otherwise." He smiled thinly. "Records can be wrong." Whitaker reached for her camera again, and his partner's hand went to his belt. Not the gun, just the edge of his flashlight, but it was enough. I lifted a hand between them. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steady. But this footage goes to the state tonight. So whatever you're protecting, you might want to start rehearsing your statement." We backed toward the car, the storm breaking overhead just as we reached it. Lightning cracked somewhere beyond the barn, throwing the whole scene into brief daylight. For an instant I saw Glay's face, calm, unbothered, like a man who still believed time would protect him. But time was the one thing he'd just run out of. We sped off down the muddy road, rain hammering the windshield so hard the wipers couldn't keep up. Neither of us spoke until we reached the highway. Then Whitaker said, "You think they'll come after us?" I told her maybe. But the tape was already uploaded, her contact already waiting. The moment that file opens, I said this stops being ours. When I got home that night, the rain still coming down, I sat in the dark for a long while, listening to it beat against the roof. My phone buzzed once Whitaker's message. Sent. Safe. Tomorrow, everything changes. I stared at those words until they blurred. The next morning, they did change. The story broke before dawn. 2 bodies found linked to a decades-old disappearance, new evidence implicating former Sheriff Tom Glay and industrialist Richard Kane. By noon, the farm was surrounded by deputies from neighboring counties, state investigators, and reporters in raincoats shouting questions. They found the crate exactly where we'd left it, the bodies arranged as if they'd been waiting all along. And somewhere under that soft Missouri soil, the last lie of Mill Creek finally came undone. I watched the coverage from my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first opened that old file box. The faces on the screen were younger now, the voices urgent, but the story they told was one I'd known for years. The powerful protecting themselves, the forgotten left in silence until someone decided the silence had lasted long enough. When the anchors said my name, I turned off the TV. The house was quiet again. Out the window, the rain had stopped and the sky was the color of pewter calm, but heavy. I poured myself a cup of coffee, let it sit untouched, and waited for whatever came next. Somewhere out there, I knew Kane's people were scrambling, files being shredded, calls being made, but the land didn't care about any of that. It just held its secrets until someone asked the right question. That night, as the wind moved through the trees, I could almost hear the same sound that had started all of this. The faint creak of rope, the hush of soil settling the echo of voices that never really left. I sat by the window until the moon came out pale and watchful, and I thought about the Halloways, about what it meant to be seen after so long. Tomorrow would bring charges, maybe justice, maybe not. But for the first time in half a century, the truth had air. And sometimes that's enough to wake the dead. The morning they arrested Sheriff Tom Glay, the clouds were low and heavy, the kind that hold the air still before a storm. I watched the footage from my kitchen table, his hands cuffed neatly in front of him, his eyes flat like a man walking through the last familiar hallway he'd ever see. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. Maybe because he knew it was never really about whether the truth would come out, only when. The same courthouse steps where he'd once held press conferences and promised order now framed him in disgrace. Behind him, deputies carried out boxes of files that had sat untouched for decades, gathering dust and silence. Richard Kane's name surfaced a few days later, pulled from corporate ledgers and personal correspondence recovered from his estate. He'd died 15 years earlier, his obituary full of charity work and civic pride. But now every smiling photograph of him in the local museum felt like a ghost trying to pass for human. The investigation confirmed what we'd known deep down: the Halloways had refused to sell. Kane wanted their land for a grain route. Glay made sure refusal wasn't an option. The two of them wrote that story together, power and fear binding ink to paper. Whitaker called me that night from a hotel outside St. Louis. Her voice carried that edge between exhaustion and disbelief. "They're finally saying their names on air," she told me. "Robert and Elaine. Not the missing couple, not the cold case. Their names. I could hear the hum of the TV in the background, newscasters dissecting the story like it was just another segment in a cycle that never ends. "You did that," she said. I told her, no, it wasn't me. It was the land. The land had been talking all along, we just finally learned to listen. A few weeks later, I stood on that same ground again, this time surrounded by yellow tape and fresh tire tracks. The air smelled of wet clay and sawdust from the crates the forensic team used to move the remains. I thought it would feel like victory, but it didn't. It felt like standing in a graveyard that had waited too long for visitors. The wind moved through the wheat like it was whispering something you couldn't quite catch. One of the younger agents, barely old enough to remember dial phones, nodded toward me and said, "Hard to believe they've been here this whole time." I looked at him and said, "It's not hard to believe at all. It's hard to admit. When they reinterred the Halloways, the county tried to make it an official event. Flags, prayers, speeches. I stayed back near the fence with Frank Dalton, who'd been helped there by his niece. He wore his best jacket, the kind of thing people keep for weddings and funerals alike. Took him long enough, he said softly, eyes never leaving the coffins. "You ever think it'd happen?" I shook my head. No. But maybe it was never about that. Maybe it was just about not letting them be forgotten. He nodded the way men do when they agree with more than they're willing to say out loud. Whitaker's documentary aired that fall. She didn't dramatize it, didn't soften it. Just quiet truth layered over footage of the fields and the house now little more than broken boards and memory. She ended it with a single line my voice recorded months earlier without my realizing she'd kept it. "The dead don't need our pity. They just need us to remember their names." When I first heard it, I felt exposed, like someone had read my thoughts out loud. But over time, I came to see it as the right ending, not just for them, but for everyone who ever wondered if justice could still find its way through old, tangled roots. After the broadcast, letters started arriving at my mailbox, handwritten careful. Some from people who'd lived near Mill Creek all their lives and claimed they knew something wasn't right back then. Others from families who'd lost someone long ago and were still waiting for an answer that might never come. One woman wrote, "It gives me peace to think that silence doesn't last forever." I didn't write back, but I kept every letter in a drawer. Some stories don't end, they just settle into the shape of whoever carries them next. Glay died in custody 2 years later. Natural causes, the paper said. I went to the funeral not out of forgiveness, but because I needed to see the dirt fall and know it was over. There were only a handful of people there, mostly county men who'd aged out of relevance. When the preacher spoke about sin and salvation, I looked down at my shoes, listening to the sound of rain hitting the tent. I didn't believe in salvation the way they meant it. I believed in consequence. And in that small way, the world had balanced itself again. Kane's estate paid restitution to what was left of the Halloway family. A niece in Kansas inherited the funds, but used them to establish a scholarship for local students' agriculture majors of all things. "To remind us that good land doesn't belong to bad men," she said during the dedication. I didn't attend that ceremony, but I watched it later on the news. The field behind her shimmered under the sun, and for the first time it looked alive instead of haunted. Whitaker moved on to other projects, missing persons, environmental crimes, but she still called once a year. Sometimes we didn't talk about the case at all, just about life. Her little boy starting school, my arthritis acting up small things that fill the space time leaves behind. Every now and then she'd mention that episode streaming somewhere new, finding new viewers who'd never heard of Mill Creek. "They're remembering them," she'd say. And that was enough. As for me, I kept the farmhouse key. Found it years ago under a loose brick by the steps. I never told anyone. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It sits in a wooden box on my shelf next to a copy of the old police report, the one stamped closed in red ink. The irony of that word still makes me shake my head. Some cases end because someone says so. Others end because the truth finally runs out of places to hide. When I drive through that part of Missouri now, I always slow down at the turnoff for the old Halloway property. There's nothing left of the house. The county cleared it, leveled the ground, planted wild grass. But if you stand there at dusk, you can see where the porch used to be. The faint outline of square stone buried just beneath the surface. Sometimes when the light hits it right, it glows a little like the earth hasn't fully decided whether to let it go. I like to think that's their way of saying they're at peace, but I don't pretend to know. I just stand there a moment, hat in hand, and let the silence wash over me. I'm not sure what justice means anymore. Maybe it's not verdicts or headlines. Maybe it's the simple act of saying someone's name out loud after too many years of nobody daring to. Maybe it's taking a story that was buried and handing it back to the world, dirt and all, so we can see what we're capable of, both the cruelty and the grace. The world keeps moving. Farms get sold, towns change their names, people forget. But every so often the ground remembers. That's what I carry now, the understanding that memory has weight. It presses down until someone lifts it just enough for light to find its way in. The Halloways found theirs, even if it came late. I guess that's all any of us can hope for, that when the truth comes, it still matters. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.